The moment I heard the lock click behind me, I knew something was terribly wrong. I was standing in the grand foyer of Hillcrest Manor, my single suitcase in one hand and my nursing credentials in the other, when Jessica Harrison smiled at me with teeth that were too white and eyes that were too cold. She had just handed me the keys to what she called my temporary quarters, but the way she said temporary made my skin crawl. Little did I know that this woman had already written the final chapter of my employment before I'd even unpacked my first sweater. What she didn't know was that I'd find something in that mansion that would flip her entire plan upside down and show her exactly who was really in control. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The classified ad had seemed like a blessing when I found it tucked between dog walking services and furniture sales in the Hartford Courant. Live-in caretaker needed for elderly gentlemen in Maple Ridge. Competitive salary, private quarters, references required. Contact Emma Chen, attorney at law. I remember staring at those words while sitting in my cramped studio apartment, the divorce papers still scattered across my kitchen table like fallen leaves after a storm. After 22 years of marriage and 15 years as a registered nurse, I found myself starting over at 45, with nothing but my professional skills and a determination to rebuild my life from the ground up. The divorce had been brutal, not because David and I fought over money or possessions, but because we simply grew into strangers living in the same house. He kept the house in West Hartford, the one where we'd planned to raise children who never came. I kept my car, my nursing certification, and a savings account that wouldn't last more than 3 months if I didn't find work soon. The hospital where I'd worked for over a decade had gone through budget cuts, and my position was eliminated, along with 12 others. Suddenly, at an age when I thought I'd have everything figured out, I was unemployed, unmarried, and utterly uncertain about what came next. When I called the number in the ad, a crisp, professional voice answered on the second ring. Emma Chen spoke with the efficiency of someone who handled important matters for important people. But there was warmth underneath her business tone. She explained that her client, Robert Harrison, was a 72-year-old widower who needed assistance with daily activities following a mild stroke 6 months earlier. Nothing too demanding, she assured me, mostly companionship, meal preparation, medication management, and help with mobility. The position included a converted carriage house apartment on the property, full benefits, and a salary that was 30% higher than what I'd been making at the hospital. The interview took place on a crisp October morning at Hillcrest Manor, and I'll never forget my first glimpse of the estate. The mansion sat like a crown jewel on a hill overlooking the Connecticut River Valley, its weathered brick facade and wraparound porches. Speaking of old money and older traditions, the circular driveway was lined with mature oak trees, their leaves just beginning to turn brilliant shades of amber and crimson. A wrought iron gate with the letter H worked into an intricate design stood open, welcoming but imposing. As I drove my 10-year-old Honda up the winding drive, I felt like I was entering a different world entirely. Emma Chen met me at the front door, a petite woman in her 50s wearing a navy blue suit and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned her place in rooms where important decisions were made. She gave me a tour of the public areas of the house, and I was struck by the grandeur that managed to feel lived in rather than museum-like. The library walls were lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, and a stone fireplace dominated one end of the room. Original oil paintings hung in gilded frames throughout the house, and Persian rugs covered gleaming hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. Robert Harrison was waiting for us in the sunroom, a glass-enclosed space that looked out over formal gardens and a small pond. He was a tall man with silver hair and intelligent blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Despite needing a walking cane, he stood to greet me with a firm handshake and a smile that reached his eyes. We talked for nearly an hour about everything from my nursing background to my thoughts on current events, and I found myself genuinely enjoying his company. He was articulate, funny, and clearly lonely in the way that people become when they've lost their life partner and find themselves rattling around in a house full of memories. During our conversation, he mentioned his late son, Michael, with obvious pride and deep sadness. Michael had been an architect who died in a car accident just 6 months earlier, leaving behind a wife but no children. Robert spoke about how difficult it had been to lose both his wife and his son within 2 years of each other, and how the house sometimes felt too big and too quiet. He needed someone who could help him maintain his independence, while providing the support that would allow him to stay in his beloved home, rather than moving to an assisted living facility. Emma Chen walked me through the practical details of the position, and everything seemed straightforward and professional. The carriage house apartment was charming, with a small kitchen, living area, bedroom, and bathroom. It had been recently renovated and furnished with care, featuring built-in bookcases, a window seat that looked out over the gardens, and enough space for me to feel like I had my own private sanctuary. The salary and benefits package was generous, more than fair for the level of care required. Robert would need help with medication management, meal preparation, light housekeeping, and companionship, but he was largely independent and mentally sharp. As Emma was showing me the apartment, she mentioned almost casually that Robert's daughter-in-law Jessica would be stopping by regularly to check on things. "She's very involved in Robert's care," Emma said, with what I now recognize was a carefully neutral tone. "She has her own key to the house and considers herself something of a family overseer since Michael's death." At the time, I thought this sounded perfectly reasonable. It seemed natural that his son's widow would want to ensure he was being properly cared for, and I appreciated that I'd be working with family members who were engaged and concerned. I accepted the position that same day, and Emma had the employment contracts ready within hours. Everything was handled with professional efficiency, from the background check to the insurance paperwork. Robert seemed genuinely pleased that I'd agreed to take the job, and he insisted on giving me a tour of the grounds himself, pointing out the greenhouse where his late wife had grown orchids, the small pond where they'd fed ducks every morning, and the bench where they'd sit to watch the sunset over the valley. There was something deeply touching about the way he shared these memories, and I knew that this job would be more than just medical care. It would be about providing companionship to someone who'd experienced profound loss. I moved in on a Sunday afternoon in early November, when the New England autumn was at its peak, and the air carried the sweet scent of wood smoke from chimneys throughout the valley. Robert helped me carry my boxes despite my protests, and he seemed energized by having someone new in the house. We spent the evening talking in the library while a fire crackled in the fireplace, and he told me stories about the house's history, the changes he'd witnessed in Maple Ridge over the decades, and his hopes for maintaining his independence as he aged. That first week passed peacefully as we established our routines. Robert was an early riser who liked his coffee strong and his breakfast simple. He took pride in reading 3 newspapers each morning, and he enjoyed discussing current events with someone who could engage with his opinions and observations. His mobility was good despite the cane, and his mind was sharp as ever. He needed help organizing his medications and appreciated having someone prepare nutritious meals, but mostly he seemed grateful for the companionship and the knowledge that help was nearby if needed. The warning signs about Jessica began almost immediately, though I was too focused on settling into my new role to recognize them for what they were. She appeared on my 3rd day without warning, using her key to enter through the front door while I was helping Robert with his morning physical therapy exercises. I heard the sound of heels clicking across the marble foyer, and then a voice called out in a tone that managed to sound both sweet and sharp at the same time. Jessica Harrison was a striking woman in her late 30s with auburn hair that fell in perfect waves and makeup that looked professionally applied even at 10 in the morning. She wore designer clothes with the kind of casual confidence that spoke of significant disposable income, and she carried herself like someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. When she found us in the sunroom, she greeted Robert with an air kiss that didn't quite touch his cheek, and turned to me with an appraising look that made me feel like livestock being evaluated at auction. "So you must be Sarah," she said with a smile that was all surface and no depth. "I'm Jessica, Michael's wife. Well, widow now, I suppose." She laughed at this as if it were somehow amusing rather than tragic, and I noticed Robert's jaw tighten slightly. "I'm so glad Daddy Bob finally found someone to help out around here. The place has been falling apart without proper supervision." She looked around the sunroom with exaggerated concern, though everything appeared immaculate to my eyes. During that first encounter, Jessica made several comments that set my teeth on edge, but that I tried to interpret charitably. She referred to Robert as Daddy Bob, in a tone that was somehow both affectionate and condescending, as if he were a child rather than a capable adult who happened to need some assistance. She questioned whether he was taking his medications properly, despite the fact that I'd already established a system that was working perfectly. She suggested that maybe he shouldn't be attempting physical therapy exercises without consulting his doctor first, even though the exercises had been prescribed by his physician and were clearly benefiting his mobility and strength. Most troubling was the way she spoke about the house and Robert's living situation, as if major changes were inevitable, rather than possible choices. She made comments about how difficult it must be for him to maintain such a large property, how isolating it must feel to live so far from town, and how much work it must be to manage all the upkeep and maintenance. When Robert mentioned that he'd been thinking about having the roof on the carriage house inspected, Jessica immediately jumped in with suggestions about contractors and seemed to take charge of the decision-making process in a way that felt presumptuous. After she left that day, Robert was noticeably quieter than usual. We had lunch together as had become our custom, but the easy conversation we'd developed over the past few days felt strained. Finally, as I was clearing the dishes, he looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts apologetic and weary. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I hope you'll understand that Jessica means well, but she sometimes has very strong opinions about what's best for everyone. She's been through a lot with losing Michael, and I think she's trying to process her grief by taking care of people. I want you to know that any decisions about my care or my living situation will be made by me, in consultation with you and Emma Chen, no one else." I assured him that I understood completely, and that I was there to support whatever choices he felt were best for his health and happiness. But even as I said the words, I had an uneasy feeling that Jessica Harrison had her own ideas about what my role should be, and they might not align with either Robert's wishes or my professional judgment. That night, as I sat in my cozy apartment looking out over the gardens, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were undercurrents in this family dynamic that I didn't yet understand. The next few days reinforced my growing concern about Jessica's approach to Robert's care. She called the house every morning around 9, ostensibly to check on how Robert was feeling, but actually to quiz me about every detail of his daily routine. What had he eaten for breakfast? Had he taken all his medications? What exercises had we done? Had he mentioned feeling dizzy or confused? The questions felt more like an interrogation than genuine concern, and they were asked in a tone that suggested she expected to find problems with my care. She also began stopping by unannounced at various times throughout the day, always with some excuse about dropping off mail or checking on something in the house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During these visits, she'd ask Robert leading questions about whether he was feeling overwhelmed by all the activity of having someone new in the house, whether he missed his privacy, whether he felt like the caretaking arrangement was more trouble than it was worth. Robert handled these questions with patience and grace, but I could see the toll they were taking on him. What disturbed me most was the way Jessica spoke about Robert's capabilities and needs when she thought he couldn't hear her. She'd pull me aside in the kitchen or corner me in the hallway to share her concerns about his declining condition, his increasing confusion, his growing frailty, but none of these observations matched what I was seeing in my daily interactions with him. Robert was cognitively sharp, physically stable, and emotionally resilient. He had some mobility limitations and needed help with certain tasks, but he was far from the declining, vulnerable elder that Jessica described in her worried whispers. By the end of my second week at Hillcrest Manor, I'd begun to recognize a pattern in Jessica's behavior that reminded me of something I'd seen during my years as a hospital nurse. There are family members who genuinely advocate for their loved ones' best interests, and then there are family members who create drama and crisis because it serves their own psychological or practical needs. Jessica seemed to fall into the latter category, constantly looking for problems, manufacturing concerns, and positioning herself as the expert on what Robert needed, despite having no medical training and spending far less time with him than I did. The situation came to a head during my third week when Jessica arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a stack of brochures and wearing an expression of determined concern. She'd brought information about assisted living facilities in the area, and she wanted to sit down with Robert to discuss what she called his long-term care options. When Robert politely but firmly declined to look at the brochures, explaining that he was happy with his current living arrangement and felt no need to consider alternatives, Jessica's facade of sweet concern slipped just enough for me to see the steel underneath. "Daddy Bob," she said with a laugh that had no humor in it, "you're not thinking clearly about this. You can't stay in this big house forever, and it's not fair to expect Sarah to take care of everything. What happens when your condition gets worse? What happens when you need more care than one person can provide? Wouldn't it be better to make this transition while you're still healthy enough to adapt to a new environment?" Robert's response was measured but firm. "Jessica, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to consider moving anywhere. My doctor is satisfied with my current level of functioning. Sarah is doing an excellent job helping me maintain my independence, and I'm comfortable and happy in my own home. If my needs change in the future, we can reassess then, but right now I see no reason to make any major changes." That's when I saw something in Jessica's eyes that chilled me to the bone. It was a flash of pure frustration, quickly covered by renewed concern, but unmistakable in its intensity. She wasn't advocating for Robert's well-being out of love or worry. She was pushing for changes that served her own agenda, and his resistance to her suggestions was clearly not part of her plan. In that moment, I realized that Jessica Harrison saw me not as an ally in Robert's care, but as an obstacle to whatever outcome she was working toward. As I helped Robert to his room that evening and we went through his usual bedtime routine of medications and settling in for the night, he seemed more tired than usual. Not physically tired, but emotionally drained in the way that people get when they're constantly having to defend reasonable choices against unreasonable pressure. Before I left him for the night, he took my hand gently and said something that would prove to be more prophetic than either of us realized at the time. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I want you to know how grateful I am that you're here. Not just for the practical help, though that means the world to me, but for treating me like a person who's capable of making decisions about his own life. I've spent the months since Michael died feeling like everyone wants to manage me, rather than simply support me. You make me feel like myself again, and that's a gift I hadn't expected to receive." I assured him that it was my privilege to work with him, and that I'd continue to respect his autonomy and support his choices as long as he wanted me there. But as I walked back to the carriage house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica Harrison had very different plans for both Robert's future and my continued employment. What I didn't know yet was just how far she was willing to go to implement those plans, or what secrets about Robert's financial situation would eventually give me the power to protect both of us from her manipulations. The first real attack on my competence came disguised as helpful concern, and I almost missed it entirely. It was a Monday morning in late November, when Jessica arrived earlier than usual, letting herself into the house while Robert and I were having breakfast in the sunroom. She breezed in carrying coffee and pastries from an expensive bakery in town, acting as though she'd simply wanted to treat us to something special. But within minutes, the real purpose of her visit became clear. As we sat around the small table sharing the pastries, Jessica began asking Robert about his weekend in a way that seemed casual but felt calculated. Had he been feeling well? Had he slept okay? Had he remembered to take his evening medications? When Robert mentioned that he'd felt a bit dizzy on Saturday morning, Jessica's eyes lit up with what appeared to be concern that felt more like satisfaction. She immediately began questioning me about how I'd handled the situation, whether I'd taken his blood pressure, whether I'd considered calling his doctor, whether I'd documented the incident properly. The truth was that Robert had felt briefly lightheaded after standing up too quickly from his reading chair, a common occurrence for anyone his age, and particularly for someone taking blood pressure medication. I'd helped him sit back down, encouraged him to rest for a few minutes, and checked his vitals. Everything had been normal, and the dizziness had passed completely within minutes. It was the kind of minor incident that happens regularly with elderly patients and requires monitoring but not medical intervention. But Jessica seized on this moment as evidence of what she called a concerning pattern of declining stability. She began talking about how these episodes were probably happening more frequently than Robert realized, how they could be signs of more serious underlying problems, and how important it was to have proper medical oversight of his condition. She suggested that maybe I should be keeping more detailed logs of every symptom or incident, no matter how minor. She wondered aloud whether Robert's current level of care was adequate for someone who was obviously experiencing increasing health challenges. What made this attack particularly insidious was the way Jessica framed her concerns as being supportive of both Robert and me. She wasn't questioning my competence directly. She was simply worried that I might be overwhelmed by Robert's complex needs. She wasn't criticizing Robert's decision to remain at home. She was just concerned that his condition might be deteriorating faster than any of us realized. She positioned herself as the voice of reason and caution, looking out for everyone's best interests in a difficult situation. Robert handled her interrogation with remarkable grace, calmly explaining that he felt fine, that the dizzy spell had been minor and brief, and that he had complete confidence in my ability to assess when medical attention might be needed. But I could see the effect her words were having on him. He began second-guessing himself, wondering if maybe he should be more worried about the incident, questioning whether he was being realistic about his own condition. After Jessica left that day, Robert was quieter than usual, and I noticed him paying closer attention to every minor sensation or momentary fatigue. When he reached for his coffee cup, and his hand trembled slightly due to the natural effects of aging, he looked at me with concern and asked if I thought it was getting worse. When he paused to catch his breath after climbing the stairs, something he'd done without comment for weeks, he wondered aloud if maybe he was declining faster than he'd realized. That evening, I found myself doing something I'd never done in my 15 years as a nurse. I began documenting every detail of Robert's day, not because it was medically necessary, but because I realized that Jessica was building a case against both his competence and my caregiving abilities. I wrote down what he ate, how he slept, every medication he took, every activity we did together, and every minor symptom or complaint he mentioned. I started this documentation not to provide better care, but to protect myself and Robert from accusations that I wasn't properly monitoring his condition. The documentation proved to be prescient, because Jessica's campaign against my competence was just beginning. Over the next week, she called the house multiple times each day, always with questions about Robert's condition that seemed designed to uncover problems rather than simply stay informed. She asked whether he'd seemed confused about anything, whether his appetite had changed, whether he'd had any more dizzy spells, whether his mobility seemed to be declining. When I answered these questions honestly, explaining that Robert was stable and functioning well, Jessica would respond with comments like, "Well, you might not notice gradual changes since you see him every day," or "Sometimes family members pick up on things that caregivers miss." She also began calling Emma Chen, Robert's attorney, with what she described as concerns about his care and living situation. I learned about these calls when Emma contacted me directly to ask about Robert's condition and my assessment of his needs. Emma was professional and diplomatic, but I could tell that Jessica's calls were creating pressure for everyone involved. She was painting a picture of a declining elderly man who was possibly receiving inadequate care from an inexperienced caretaker, and she was doing it in a way that seemed motivated by genuine concern rather than personal agenda. The situation escalated when Jessica arranged for Robert's doctor to make an unscheduled house call, ostensibly to check on his recovery from the recent dizzy spell, but actually to conduct what felt like an evaluation of both his competence and my caregiving abilities. Dr. Patricia Williams was Robert's longtime physician, a woman in her 60s who'd been treating him for over a decade and knew his baseline functioning well. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with Jessica in tow, and I immediately sensed that this visit had been orchestrated for purposes beyond routine medical care. Dr. Williams examined Robert thoroughly and pronounced him to be in excellent condition for a man his age with his medical history. His blood pressure was well controlled, his cognitive function was sharp, and his mobility was actually better than it had been several months earlier. She was pleased with his medication compliance, his nutrition, and his overall demeanor. In her professional opinion, he was thriving in his current living situation and showed no signs of needing more intensive medical supervision or consideration of alternative care arrangements. But Jessica wasn't satisfied with this positive assessment. She began pressing Dr. Williams about the long-term trajectory of Robert's condition, the possibility of future decline. the wisdom of planning ahead for increased care needs. She asked leading questions about whether it might be safer for someone in Robert's condition to live in a facility with 24-hour medical staff, whether his current home environment posed any safety risks, whether his isolation from other people his age might be contributing to depression or cognitive decline. Dr. Williams handled these questions with professional patience, but I could see that she was growing irritated with Jessica's persistence in looking for problems that didn't exist. Finally, she addressed the situation directly. "Jessica," she said in the calm but firm tone that doctors use when they need to establish boundaries, "Robert is doing remarkably well for someone who's experienced the losses and health challenges he's faced over the past year. His current care arrangement is clearly working well for him, and I see no medical reason to consider any changes. If his condition changes in the future, we can reassess then, but right now my recommendation is to continue exactly what you're all doing." After Dr. Williams left, Jessica's mask of concern slipped entirely for just a moment, and I saw the raw frustration underneath. She'd clearly hoped that the doctor's visit would validate her concerns and provide ammunition for pushing Robert toward a care facility. Instead, she'd received a professional endorsement of his current situation and my caregiving abilities. As she gathered her purse and prepared to leave, she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said something that felt more like a threat than a promise. "Well, Sarah, I guess you're doing better than I thought. But things can change so quickly with elderly people. One day they're fine, and the next day they're not. I just hope you're prepared for whatever might come up. It would be terrible if something happened to Daddy Bob because the right precautions weren't taken." That night, as I sat in my apartment reviewing the day's events, I realized that Jessica Harrison wasn't going to give up on her campaign to move Robert out of his home. She'd simply changed tactics. If she couldn't prove that he was declining or that I was providing inadequate care, she'd find another way to achieve whatever outcome she was working toward. What I didn't understand yet was what she had to gain from displacing Robert, or what resources I might have to protect both of us from her increasingly aggressive interference. The answer to both of those questions was hidden in a locked file cabinet in Robert's study, waiting to be discovered on a snowy December morning that would change everything. December arrived with an early snowstorm that blanketed the Connecticut countryside in pristine white, transforming Hillcrest Manor into something from a winter postcard. The beauty of the season should have brought peace, but instead it marked the beginning of Jessica's most calculated assault on my position and Robert's independence. What started as subtle undermining evolved into systematic sabotage, and I found myself fighting a war one hadn't realized I'd entered. The first salvo came disguised as holiday generosity. Jessica arrived on the morning after the snowstorm with bags full of what she called early Christmas presents for Robert. But these weren't typical gifts from a loving daughter-in-law. Instead, they were items clearly chosen to emphasize his age and supposed frailty. A medical alert bracelet that would supposedly give everyone peace of mind. A pill organizer with large compartments and bold day-of-the-week labels, despite the fact that his current medication system was working perfectly. A magnifying glass with an LED light for reading, even though his vision was fine with his regular glasses. Most insulting of all, a shower chair and grab bars that she insisted needed to be installed immediately for his safety. Robert accepted these gifts with the gracious politeness of someone who'd been raised never to reject a present, regardless of how it made him feel. But I could see the impact they had on his self-perception. Each item was a physical reminder that Jessica viewed him as increasingly helpless, and their presence in his home began to change how he saw himself. He started using the magnifying glass even when he didn't need it, as if he should require assistance with tasks he'd been managing independently. He wore the medical alert bracelet despite complaining that it was uncomfortable, because Jessica had made such a point about how much safer it would make everyone feel. The shower chair was the final straw for Robert's dignity. When the handyman Jessica had hired arrived unannounced to install the grab bars and position the plastic seat in his beautiful master bathroom, Robert finally pushed back with quiet but unmistakable firmness. He thanked the man for his time but explained that the modifications weren't needed or wanted. Jessica, who had been supervising the installation, immediately launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about bathroom falls being the leading cause of injury among seniors, and how prevention was so much better than dealing with consequences after an accident. Robert listened to her entire lecture with patience that I was beginning to recognize as carefully controlled frustration. When she finished, he responded in a tone that was gentle but absolutely final. "Jessica, I appreciate your concern for my safety, but I'm perfectly capable of showering independently, and I don't want my bathroom modified. If I ever feel that I need additional safety equipment, I'll discuss it with Dr. Williams and make those decisions myself. Please ask the gentleman to pack up his tools." The expression that crossed Jessica's face in that moment was quickly masked, but I caught it clearly. It wasn't disappointment or worry about Robert's safety. It was anger at having her authority challenged and her plans thwarted. She'd obviously invested time and probably money in arranging these modifications, and Robert's refusal to accept them represented more than just rejected help. It was a rejection of her assessment of his capabilities and her right to make decisions about his living environment. After the handyman left, Jessica stayed for what she called a family discussion about Robert's living situation. She positioned this conversation as being motivated by love and concern, but her tactics felt more like psychological manipulation, designed to wear down his resistance to her suggestions. She talked about how much more difficult winter would be for him in such an isolated location, how dangerous the long driveway could become with ice and snow, how much harder it would be for me to get help if there was an emergency during a storm. She painted vivid pictures of worst-case scenarios, describing accidents that could happen when he was alone, medical emergencies that might occur when I was off duty, natural disasters that could leave him stranded without proper support systems. She talked about her own worry and stress, how difficult it was for her to sleep at night knowing that he was so far from immediate medical care, how guilty she would feel if something happened to him because the right precautions hadn't been taken. What made this manipulation particularly effective was the way Jessica wove legitimate concerns together with exaggerated fears. It was true that winter weather could make the rural location more challenging. It was reasonable to think about emergency preparedness for an elderly person with health conditions. But Jessica took these realistic considerations and amplified them into catastrophic possibilities that required immediate and dramatic action. Throughout this conversation, she kept returning to the theme that Robert wasn't thinking clearly about his own limitations and needs. She suggested that his attachment to the house was emotional rather than practical, that his desire to maintain independence was putting him at unnecessary risk, that his resistance to her suggestions was evidence of poor judgment rather than reasonable self-determination. She was systematically undermining his confidence in his own decision-making abilities, while positioning herself as the rational voice of safety and responsibility. Robert handled this psychological assault with remarkable composure, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. By the time Jessica finally left that afternoon, he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He sat in his library for a long time after she was gone, staring out the window at the snow-covered gardens with an expression of deep weariness. When I brought him his afternoon tea, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed older than they had just hours earlier. "Sarah," he said quietly, "do you think I'm being stubborn about staying here? Am I putting myself or you at risk because I can't accept that things have changed?" The questions broke my heart because they revealed how successfully Jessica had planted seeds of self-doubt in a man who'd been confident and decisive just weeks earlier. I assured him that his choice to remain in his own home was entirely reasonable, and that his current level of functioning didn't warrant any changes to his living situation. But I could see that Jessica's words had found their target, and he was beginning to question his own judgment. Over the following days, Jessica intensified her campaign by involving other people in what she framed as collaborative concern for Robert's well-being. She called his doctor's office multiple times with questions about winter safety for elderly patients, his attorney with concerns about his ability to make complex decisions, and even his bank with inquiries about whether his financial affairs were being properly managed. She wasn't making direct accusations about his competence, but she was creating a paper trail of documented concerns that could later be used to support arguments about his declining capabilities. She also began reaching out to Robert's few remaining friends and distant relatives, sharing her worries about his isolation and his resistance to accepting help. These conversations were carefully crafted to sound like a devoted daughter-in-law seeking support and advice, but their real purpose was to build a network of people who would agree that Robert needed more supervision and care than his current situation provided. Jessica understood that changing someone's living situation against their will required social and professional consensus, and she was methodically building that consensus through strategic conversations with anyone who might have influence. The impact of this social campaign became clear when Robert began receiving calls from people he hadn't heard from in months, all expressing sudden concern about how he was managing in his big house during the winter. His former business partner called to suggest that maybe it was time to consider a change. A cousin from California phoned to share her worries about him being so isolated. His late wife's best friend stopped by to say that she'd been thinking about him and wondering if he'd given any thought to the lovely senior community where her neighbor had moved. Each of these conversations was presented as spontaneous concern, but the similarity in their themes and timing made it obvious that they'd been orchestrated by Jessica. Robert was too polite to suggest that his friends and relatives were being manipulated, but I could see that he was beginning to feel surrounded by a chorus of voices, all singing the same song about his need for more support and supervision. The cumulative effect was to make him feel like everyone who cared about him believed he was making poor decisions about his own life. Meanwhile, Jessica began undermining my professional competence through a series of incidents that were designed to look like honest mistakes or oversights on my part. She would call the house when she knew Robert was napping and express concern that he was sleeping too much during the day, implying that I wasn't keeping him engaged or active enough. She would arrive during mealtimes and comment on his food choices, suggesting that maybe his nutrition wasn't being properly monitored, or that he seemed to be losing weight under my care. Most insidiously, she began questioning my professional qualifications and experience in conversations with Robert when she thought I couldn't hear. She would wonder aloud whether a hospital nurse really had the specialized training needed to care for someone with his specific conditions, whether I understood the unique challenges of geriatric care, whether my relatively recent divorce might be affecting my ability to focus properly on my responsibilities. These comments were always framed as innocent questions or gentle concerns, but their cumulative effect was to plant doubt about whether I was the right person for the job. Jessica also started creating documentation of supposed problems with my care by sending herself emails, summarizing her observations during visits to the house. She would write detailed messages describing Robert's appearance, mood, and comments, always with subtle implications that something wasn't quite right. She noted when he seemed tired, when he appeared confused about minor details, when he moved more slowly than usual, when his appetite seemed diminished. None of these observations reflected actual problems with his health or my care, but they created a written record that could be interpreted as evidence of decline or inadequate supervision. The psychological pressure of this sustained campaign began affecting both Robert and me in ways that Jessica had clearly anticipated. Robert became more cautious and self-conscious about his daily activities, second-guessing decisions he would have made confidently just weeks earlier. He started asking me whether I thought he should attempt certain tasks, whether his walking seemed unsteady, whether I'd noticed any changes in his memory or thinking. Jessica's constant focus on his supposed limitations was making him hyper-aware of every minor stumble or momentary confusion that was perfectly normal for someone his age. I found myself becoming defensive and overly careful in my caregiving, documenting every detail of Robert's condition and my responses to ensure that I couldn't be accused of negligence or poor judgment. I started second-guessing my professional assessments, wondering if I was missing signs of decline that a more experienced geriatric caregiver might notice. The constant scrutiny and implied criticism were making me doubt my own competence in a way that I'd never experienced during my years as a hospital nurse. The situation reached a crisis point during the second week of December, when Jessica orchestrated what appeared to be a medical emergency, but was actually a carefully planned demonstration of supposed inadequate care. She had been monitoring Robert's daily routine closely and knew that Tuesday mornings were when I did the weekly grocery shopping while he rested in his library. She timed her visit to arrive during this period when she knew she would find Robert alone in the house. When I returned from the store, I found Jessica's car in the driveway and heard her voice from the library, speaking in tones of urgent concern. I hurried inside to discover her kneeling beside Robert's chair, holding his wrist as if checking his pulse, while speaking rapidly into her cell phone about an elderly man who appeared to be having some kind of episode. Robert looked confused and alarmed, but not ill, and when he saw me, he immediately tried to explain that he was fine and didn't understand why Jessica was so upset. According to Jessica's dramatic account, she had arrived to find Robert disoriented and unable to remember what day it was. She claimed that he had seemed confused about where he was and had difficulty recognizing her initially. She described him as appearing pale and shaky, with speech that seemed slurred or unclear. She had immediately called 911, she announced, because the symptoms suggested he might be having a stroke or some other serious medical event that required immediate attention. The paramedics arrived within minutes, along with a police officer who routinely responded to medical calls involving elderly residents. Jessica positioned herself as the primary source of information about Robert's condition, describing the supposed symptoms she'd observed and expressing grave concern about his recent decline. She mentioned that she'd been worried about the adequacy of his current care situation and wondered aloud whether this incident suggested that he needed more intensive medical supervision than one caregiver could provide. Robert tried to explain to the paramedics that he felt fine and couldn't understand why Jessica was so concerned, but his protests were interpreted as possible confusion or denial about his condition. The medical technicians conducted a thorough assessment of his vital signs, cognitive function, and physical coordination. Their examination revealed absolutely nothing wrong with his health, mental status, or functioning. His blood pressure was normal, his speech was clear, his memory was sharp, and his coordination was excellent. There was no medical evidence to support any of Jessica's claims about confusion, disorientation, or physical distress. When the lead paramedic announced that Robert appeared to be in perfect health and showed no signs of any medical emergency, Jessica's response revealed the true nature of her agenda. Instead of relief that her father-in-law was well, she seemed frustrated and began pressing the medical team about whether they might be missing subtle signs of a stroke or other serious condition. She suggested that maybe Robert needed to be taken to the hospital for more comprehensive testing, that maybe the symptoms had resolved by the time they arrived, but could indicate an ongoing problem. The paramedics were professional but clearly annoyed by Jessica's persistence in trying to create a medical crisis where none existed. They explained that Robert's assessment was completely normal and that there was no indication for hospitalization or further testing. They documented the call as unfounded and prepared to leave, but not before the lead technician made a comment that would prove significant later. He suggested that if family members were concerned about an elderly person's condition, they might want to discuss those concerns with the person's primary doctor, rather than calling emergency services for non-emergent situations. After the paramedics left, Robert was visibly shaken by the experience of being treated as if he were having a medical emergency when he felt perfectly fine. He couldn't understand why Jessica had been so convinced that something was wrong with him, and he began questioning whether there might be symptoms of illness that he wasn't recognizing in himself. The incident had the effect Jessica clearly intended, making Robert doubt his own perceptions of his health and capabilities while creating official documentation of supposed medical concerns. That evening, as I helped Robert process what had happened, he voiced the question that Jessica's manipulation had been designed to plant. "Sarah," he said with obvious distress, "do you think something is wrong with me that I'm not aware of? Could I be having medical problems that I can't recognize? Maybe Jessica is seeing things that I'm missing because I don't want to admit that I'm declining." The fact that this kind, intelligent, capable man was questioning his own reality because of Jessica's psychological manipulation filled me with anger that I had to carefully control. I assured Robert that his self-assessment was accurate and that Jessica's concerns weren't supported by any objective evidence. I reminded him that the paramedics had found nothing wrong with his condition and that Dr. Williams had recently pronounced him to be in excellent health. But I could see that the seed of self-doubt had been firmly planted, and Jessica's campaign was achieving its intended effect of making Robert question his ability to live independently and make decisions about his own care. The false medical emergency was followed by an escalation in Jessica's interference that made her intentions unmistakably clear. She began stopping by the house daily, always with some excuse about checking on Robert or bringing him something he supposedly needed. During these visits, she would conduct what felt like informal competency assessments, asking Robert detailed questions about current events, his daily routine, his financial affairs, and his future plans. She would note his responses carefully and follow up with leading questions designed to highlight any uncertainty or confusion. She also began bringing printed materials about local assisted living facilities, leaving them strategically placed around the house where Robert would encounter them. These brochures featured photos of smiling elderly residents engaged in group activities, descriptions of comprehensive medical care and social programs, and testimonials from families who were grateful that their loved ones were receiving proper supervision and support. Jessica would discuss these materials as if she were simply providing information for Robert to consider, but her clear expectation was that he would recognize the wisdom of making a voluntary transition to a more appropriate care setting. The final element of Jessica's systematic campaign was to begin documenting what she characterized as concerning changes in Robert's behavior and functioning. She started keeping a detailed log of her observations during visits, noting anything that could be interpreted as evidence of decline or inadequate care. She recorded that he seemed more forgetful than usual, that his mobility appeared reduced, that his appetite seemed poor, that his mood seemed depressed. None of these observations were accurate, but they created a written record that could be used to support arguments about his diminishing capacity and need for more intensive supervision. By Christmas week, the cumulative impact of Jessica's campaign had created an atmosphere of constant tension and scrutiny that was affecting everyone involved. Robert had become anxious and self-conscious about his daily activities, constantly wondering if his functioning was adequate or if he was missing signs of his own decline. I was exhausted from the emotional energy required to counteract Jessica's undermining while maintaining my professional responsibilities and supporting Robert's emotional well-being. Even the household staff who came for cleaning and maintenance had begun treating Robert with the careful solicitousness typically reserved for people who are frail or confused. The breaking point came during Christmas Eve dinner, when Jessica arrived uninvited with what she announced were important documents that needed Robert's immediate attention. These turned out to be application materials for 3 different assisted living facilities, complete with financial information requests, medical history forms, and authorization papers for tour appointments. She presented these documents as if Robert had already agreed to explore these options, and she was simply helping him move forward with the necessary paperwork. Robert's response to this presumptuous ambush was swift and unambiguous. He gathered the papers into a neat stack, walked to the fireplace, and fed them into the flames while Jessica watched in shocked silence. Then he turned to face her with a dignity and authority that reminded me of the successful businessman he had been for decades before retirement. "Jessica," he said in a voice that was quiet but carried absolute finality, "I have been patient with your concerns and respectful of your grief, but I will not tolerate any more interference in my life or my decisions. I am competent to manage my own affairs, satisfied with my current living situation, and grateful for Sarah's excellent care. I do not want to move to an assisted living facility. I do not need additional medical supervision, and I do not require your management of my daily life. If you cannot accept and respect these boundaries, then your visits to this house are no longer welcome." The mask of concerned family member finally fell away completely, and Jessica's true feelings erupted in a torrent of accusations and threats that revealed everything I needed to know about her real motivations. She accused Robert of being selfish and stubborn, of putting his own preferences ahead of practical realities, of refusing to acknowledge his obvious decline and increasing needs. She accused me of taking advantage of an elderly man's confusion, of providing inadequate care that was endangering his health, of manipulating him to keep my job regardless of his best interests. But most tellingly, she began talking about Robert's financial irresponsibility and the burden his choices were placing on his family. She mentioned the cost of maintaining such a large property, the expense of private care that might not even be necessary if he would accept more appropriate housing, the impact his decisions might have on his estate, and the inheritance that would eventually pass to his surviving family members. In her anger, Jessica revealed that her campaign to move Robert had never been about his well-being or safety. It had been about controlling his living expenses and protecting what she saw as her future financial inheritance. As Jessica stormed out of the house that Christmas Eve, slamming the door behind her and spinning her wheels on the icy driveway, I realized that the battle for Robert's independence was far from over. She had invested too much time and energy in her manipulation campaign to simply accept defeat, and her parting words suggested that she would escalate her tactics rather than retreat. She had threatened to contact Adult Protective Services about inadequate care, to pursue legal guardianship if Robert's judgment was truly compromised, and to involve other family members who would surely support her concerns about his declining condition. That night, as Robert and I sat by the fire sharing a quiet Christmas Eve dinner, he seemed lighter and more like himself than he had in weeks. The act of finally confronting Jessica's manipulation had restored some of his confidence and sense of personal agency. But he was also realistic about what lay ahead, and he asked me a question that would prove to be more important than either of us realized at the time. "Sarah," he said thoughtfully, "if Jessica continues this campaign to undermine my independence, do you think you would be willing to help me protect myself legally? I may need to document my competence and the adequacy of my current care situation in ways that could withstand scrutiny from social services or even family court. I want to make sure that my own choices about my life are legally protected, regardless of what Jessica might try to do next." I assured him that I would support him in whatever legal steps might be necessary to protect his autonomy and his right to remain in his own home. What I didn't know yet was that Robert had resources and documentation that would not only protect him from Jessica's interference, but would also give us the power to fundamentally change the dynamic between them. The key to that power was locked in a file cabinet in his study, waiting to be discovered during a search for insurance papers that would reveal far more than either of us expected. The insurance papers that would change everything were hidden behind a row of leather-bound classics in Robert's study, tucked away in a manila folder that bore the faded label, Property Holdings Confidential. I discovered them purely by accident while searching for Robert's homeowner's policy documents after a minor incident with frozen pipes in the carriage house. What I found instead was a complete financial portfolio that revealed Robert Harrison to be far wealthier and more strategically minded than I had ever imagined. The folder contained deeds, mortgage documents, rental agreements, and financial statements for multiple properties throughout Maple Ridge and the surrounding areas. But the document that made my hands tremble as I read it was a lease agreement dated just 8 months earlier, bearing the signature of one Jessica Marie Harrison as tenant and Robert Harrison as landlord. Jessica had been living in a downtown apartment that Robert owned, paying him rent of $2,400 per month, completely unaware that her monthly payments were going directly into the pocket of the man whose life she was systematically trying to control. The irony was breathtaking in its completeness. While Jessica had been orchestrating her campaign to move Robert out of his own home and into an assisted living facility, she had been unknowingly funding his independence with her own rent payments. The apartment complex where she lived, the trendy downtown building she bragged about to anyone who would listen, the space she had decorated and photographed endlessly for her social media accounts, belonged entirely to the man she was treating as an incompetent burden who needed to be managed and displaced. But the property documents revealed something even more significant than Jessica's unknowing financial relationship with Robert. The apartment building was just one piece of a carefully constructed real estate empire that Robert had been building for decades. He owned commercial properties, residential complexes, and prime development land throughout central Connecticut. The monthly rental income from these properties was substantial enough that Robert could have lived comfortably for the rest of his life without touching his other investments or savings. Jessica's campaign to reduce his living expenses by forcing him into institutional care wasn't protecting his financial security. It was entirely unnecessary given his actual wealth. The financial statements showed that Robert had been quietly generous with his property management, often charging below-market rents to tenants he knew were struggling, allowing family members to live rent-free during difficult periods, and maintaining properties to higher standards than strictly required. Jessica's apartment was listed at a rate that was nearly $300 below market value for comparable units in the area. Robert had been subsidizing her lifestyle while she simultaneously worked to diminish his autonomy and independence. As I sat in Robert's study that January morning, surrounded by evidence of his financial acumen and generous character, I realized that Jessica's manipulation campaign had been built on a foundation of complete ignorance about the man she was trying to control. She had assumed that he was a vulnerable elderly person whose resources needed to be carefully managed, and whose expenses needed to be minimized to preserve his estate. In reality, he was a sophisticated property owner whose income streams were diversified and substantial, whose financial security was never in question, and whose generosity had been directly benefiting her for months. The discovery of these documents came at a crucial time, because Jessica's threats about involving adult protective services and pursuing legal guardianship had not been empty bluster. 3 days after the Christmas Eve confrontation, a social worker named Margaret Torres appeared at Hillcrest Manor to conduct what she described as a wellness check, based on concerns that had been raised about Robert's living situation and care. Margaret was a professional woman in her 40s who approached her work with appropriate seriousness, but also with obvious skepticism about the complaints that had prompted her visit. Jessica had clearly prepared extensively for this intervention, providing Margaret with detailed documentation of her supposed observations about Robert's declining condition and inadequate care. She had compiled what appeared to be weeks of notes describing incidents of confusion, mobility problems, nutritional concerns, and medication management issues. She had also provided contact information for several people who would supposedly corroborate her assessment that Robert needed more intensive supervision than his current situation provided. Margaret conducted her evaluation with thoroughness and professionalism, spending nearly 3 hours interviewing Robert about his daily routines, his health management, his social connections, and his understanding of his own needs and limitations. She observed him performing various activities of daily living, reviewed his medication management system, and assessed his cognitive functioning through a series of standardized questions and tasks. She also interviewed me extensively about my qualifications, my caregiving approach, my observations of Robert's condition, and my assessment of any risks or concerns in his current living situation. The results of Margaret's evaluation were unambiguous and professionally devastating to Jessica's accusations. Robert demonstrated excellent cognitive functioning, appropriate self-awareness about his health and limitations, strong social connections and support systems, and clear competence in managing his own affairs. His living environment was safe, clean, and well-maintained. His nutrition was excellent, his medications were properly managed, and his overall health status was consistent with normal aging for someone with his medical history. Margaret found no evidence to support any of the concerns that had been raised about his care or his living situation. In her written report, Margaret noted that Robert appeared to be thriving in his current environment, and that his care arrangement was clearly meeting his needs effectively. She documented that the complaints about his condition seemed to be inconsistent with objective evidence, and that the person making the complaints might have motivations other than genuine concern for his well-being. Margaret's report effectively vindicated both Robert's competence and my professional caregiving, while raising questions about Jessica's credibility and motives. Jessica's response to this professional rebuke was to escalate her campaign rather than retreat from it. If she couldn't convince social services that Robert was incompetent or inadequately cared for, she would try a different approach that focused on financial rather than medical concerns. She began making inquiries about Robert's estate planning, his property management, and his business affairs, positioning herself as a concerned family member who was worried about potential financial exploitation or mismanagement. She contacted Emma Chen with questions about Robert's recent financial decisions, wondering whether he had been making unusual expenditures or investment choices that might suggest impaired judgment. She asked whether he had been changing beneficiaries on insurance policies or modifying his will in ways that seemed inconsistent with his previous wishes. She expressed concern that I might be influencing his financial decisions inappropriately, taking advantage of his trust to benefit myself or my family. Emma Chen's response to these inquiries was politely professional but clearly skeptical. She explained that Robert's financial affairs were entirely appropriate and well managed, that he had made no unusual changes to his estate planning, and that there was no evidence of any improper influence over his decision-making. She noted that Robert's mental capacity was clearly intact, and that his choices about his care and living situation were entirely within his rights to make. Emma's professional assessment effectively closed off another avenue for Jessica's interference, but it also prompted her to become more desperate and direct in her attempts to gain control. The next phase of Jessica's campaign involved trying to recruit allies among Robert's extended family and social connections, people who might be willing to support her efforts to override his preferences about his living situation. She reached out to distant cousins, former business associates, and family friends with carefully crafted narratives about her concerns for Robert's safety and well-being. She described him as isolated and possibly being taken advantage of by caregivers who might not have his best interests at heart. These outreach efforts had mixed results, largely because most people who knew Robert well found Jessica's characterizations of his condition to be inconsistent with their own observations and interactions with him. Several family members contacted Robert directly to express their confusion about Jessica's concerns, and their conversations with him quickly revealed that her descriptions of his decline were greatly exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Rather than building support for her position, Jessica's campaign began to damage her own credibility among people who mattered to Robert. The situation reached a new level of intensity when Jessica decided to involve the media in her campaign, contacting a local television station that specialized in investigative reporting about elder abuse and exploitation. She positioned herself as a whistleblower, exposing inadequate care and possible financial manipulation of a vulnerable elderly man who was too proud or confused to recognize that he needed help. She provided the reporters with her documentation of supposed decline and her theories about inappropriate caregiver influence over his decisions. The television news team arrived at Hillcrest Manor on a cold February morning, expecting to find evidence of elder neglect or abuse that would support an exposé about inadequate oversight of home care situations. Instead, they encountered an articulate, well-groomed elderly gentleman who was clearly competent and well cared for, living in a beautiful home with excellent support systems and professional medical oversight. The disconnect between Jessica's dramatic allegations and the reality of Robert's situation was so obvious that the news team quickly recognized they had been provided with misleading information. The lead reporter, a woman named Carol Stevens who had extensive experience with legitimate elder abuse cases, spent less than an hour at the house before concluding that there was no story to investigate. She explained to Jessica that Robert clearly did not fit the profile of an exploited or neglected elderly person, that his care situation appeared exemplary, and that her concerns seemed to be based on disagreements about his lifestyle choices rather than actual evidence of abuse or neglect. The news team left without filming any footage, effectively ending Jessica's attempt to use media pressure to force changes in Robert's living situation. This public failure of her media strategy seemed to trigger something desperate in Jessica's approach to the situation. Rather than accepting that her concerns had been investigated and found to be unfounded, she began making increasingly wild accusations about conspiracy and cover-up. She suggested that I had somehow manipulated the social worker's evaluation, that Emma Chen was participating in financial exploitation, that even Dr. Williams might be compromised in her assessment of Robert's condition. Her theories became more elaborate and paranoid, involving multiple professionals in what she characterized as a systematic deception designed to conceal abuse and exploitation. Robert was deeply disturbed by Jessica's escalating accusations, not because he believed them, but because they revealed the extent of her delusion and desperation. He began to understand that Jessica's campaign wasn't based on genuine concern for his well-being, but on some psychological need to control his life that went beyond rational family involvement. Her inability to accept professional assessments that contradicted her preferred narrative suggested that she was driven by motivations that had nothing to do with his actual condition or needs. The impact of Jessica's sustained campaign on Robert's daily life became increasingly difficult to ignore. Even though the professional evaluations had vindicated his competence and his care situation, the constant scrutiny and accusations were taking an emotional toll that affected his overall well-being. He became more withdrawn and cautious, second-guessing decisions that he would normally make without hesitation. The joy and contentment he had been experiencing in his home environment were being eroded by the persistent stress of defending his choices against unfounded attacks. I found myself spending increasing amounts of time documenting every aspect of Robert's care and daily activities, not for medical reasons, but to protect both of us against future accusations of inadequacy or exploitation. The spontaneous, relationship-based care that had been working so well for Robert was being replaced by defensive, documentation-heavy interactions that felt more like preparing for legal proceedings than providing compassionate support. Jessica's interference was systematically destroying the trust and comfort that had made Robert's living situation successful. The breaking point came in early March when Jessica hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance of Robert's daily activities and my caregiving practices. She positioned this invasion of privacy as necessary due diligence to protect Robert from potential abuse. But the reality was that she was now paying someone to spy on a competent adult in his own home, because she refused to accept that he was capable of making his own decisions about his life. The private investigator, a man named Frank Morrison, who specialized in elder abuse cases, spent several days observing the house and attempting to document evidence of neglect, exploitation, or inappropriate care. What he actually documented was a well-maintained household, where an elderly gentleman was receiving excellent care and living with obvious contentment and dignity. His surveillance photos showed Robert working in his garden, reading on his porch, receiving visits from friends, and engaging in normal daily activities with appropriate assistance when needed. Frank Morrison's report to Jessica was professional, but definitive in its conclusions. He found no evidence of abuse, neglect, or exploitation in Robert's care situation. He noted that Robert appeared to be in excellent health and spirits, that his caregiver was professional and appropriate in all interactions, and that his living environment met or exceeded standards for safety and comfort. Morrison's report recommended that Jessica discontinue her investigation because there was no evidence to support her concerns, and because continued surveillance could constitute harassment of competent adults. Jessica's response to the second professional rebuke was to fire Frank Morrison and begin making plans for what she described as more decisive action to protect Robert from his own poor judgment. She started consulting with attorneys about guardianship proceedings, despite the fact that multiple professional evaluations had found Robert to be completely competent. She researched the legal process for having someone declared incapable of managing their own affairs, apparently believing that persistence and determination could overcome the clear evidence of Robert's continued competence. This escalation toward legal action prompted Robert to finally take decisive steps to protect his autonomy and his right to remain in his own home. He contacted Emma Chen to discuss options for legal protection against future interference, including the possibility of obtaining restraining orders or other court intervention to prevent Jessica from continuing her harassment campaign. He also asked Emma to review his estate planning documents to ensure that his wishes about his care and his property would be legally protected regardless of what Jessica might attempt. Emma's legal research revealed that Robert had strong grounds for legal action against Jessica's interference, but she also recommended that he consider taking proactive steps to demonstrate his competence and his satisfaction with his current living situation. She suggested that he undergo comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations by independent professionals who could provide expert testimony about his capacity and his care needs if Jessica actually followed through on her threats to pursue guardianship. Robert agreed to these evaluations, and over the course of 2 weeks in March, he was assessed by a geriatrician, a neuropsychologist, and a psychiatrist, all of whom specialized in capacity evaluations for elderly adults. These comprehensive assessments included cognitive testing, functional ability evaluations, mental health screening, and detailed interviews about his understanding of his own needs and preferences. The results were consistent and unambiguous. Robert was fully competent to make decisions about his own life, his current care arrangement was appropriate and effective, and there was no medical or psychological basis for any form of guardianship or involuntary care placement. Armed with this professional documentation of his competence, Robert felt confident enough to take a step that he had been considering since Christmas. He decided to confront Jessica directly about her campaign of interference and to establish clear boundaries about her future involvement in his life. He invited her to meet with him and Emma Chen for what he described as a final discussion about his living situation and his expectations for their future relationship. The meeting took place in Emma's office on a rainy afternoon in late March, and Jessica arrived with her own attorney, a man who specialized in elder law and guardianship proceedings. She had clearly been preparing for a legal battle and expected this meeting to be the opening round of court proceedings that would ultimately give her control over Robert's affairs. Instead, she walked into a conference room where she was confronted with overwhelming professional evidence of Robert's competence and the appropriateness of his current living situation. Emma Chen presented the findings from Robert's recent evaluations, the social worker's report, the private investigator's conclusions, and the assessments from multiple medical professionals. The documentation was comprehensive and consistent in supporting Robert's competence and his right to make his own decisions about his care and living situation. Emma also presented evidence of Jessica's pattern of harassment and interference, including recordings of threatening phone calls and copies of false reports she had made to various agencies. Robert's statement to Jessica was brief, but definitive. He explained that he was satisfied with his living situation, confident in his decision-making abilities, and unwilling to tolerate any further interference in his personal affairs. He informed her that any future contact would need to be respectful and appropriate, and that continued harassment would result in legal action to protect his rights. He also mentioned, almost casually, that he had been reviewing his financial affairs and had discovered some interesting information about property ownership that might be relevant to their ongoing discussions. The mention of financial discoveries clearly alarmed Jessica, though she tried to hide her reaction. She began asking questions about what kind of property information Robert had found, and whether there were any issues with his rental properties that needed attention. Her sudden interest in his real estate holdings was transparently motivated by concern about how his property ownership might affect her own living situation, and her questions revealed that she understood there might be connections between his assets and her housing that she hadn't previously considered. Robert's response was deliberately vague, but ominous. He explained that he had been conducting a comprehensive review of all his property holdings and rental agreements, and that he was discovering some arrangements that needed to be restructured to better reflect current market conditions and his evolving financial priorities. He mentioned that some tenants might need to find alternative housing if their current arrangements were no longer sustainable or appropriate, and that he was working with Emma to implement necessary changes to his property management approach. As the meeting ended, Jessica's attorney advised her that she had no legal grounds for pursuing guardianship or any other form of involuntary intervention in Robert's affairs. The evidence of his competence was overwhelming, and her pattern of harassment could actually result in legal consequences for her if she continued her interference campaign. Jessica left the meeting clearly shaken and uncertain, apparently realizing for the first time that her efforts to control Robert might have serious negative consequences for her own situation. That evening, as Robert and I sat in his library discussing the day's events, he seemed lighter and more relaxed than he had been in months. The formal vindication of his competence and the clear establishment of legal boundaries with Jessica had restored his confidence and sense of personal agency. He was no longer the defensive, uncertain man that Jessica's campaign had temporarily created. He was once again the decisive, thoughtful person who had successfully managed complex business affairs for decades. But Robert also made it clear that the battle with Jessica wasn't necessarily over, and that he was prepared to take more decisive action if she continued her interference. He mentioned that his review of his property holdings had revealed opportunities for significant changes that might be necessary to protect his interests and ensure his continued independence. When I asked what kind of changes he was considering, he smiled with an expression that was both kind and determined, and said that some people were about to learn that taking someone for granted could have serious consequences. The next morning, Robert called Emma Chen and instructed her to begin the legal process for what he described as necessary adjustments to his property management arrangements. He specifically requested that she prepare eviction notices for tenants who had demonstrated disrespect for property owners or who had created situations that were no longer sustainable. He also asked her to begin marketing certain properties for sale, explaining that he wanted to liquidate some assets to fund charitable activities that would honor his late wife's memory and his own values. As Emma worked on implementing Robert's instructions, I realized that Jessica's campaign to control his life was about to backfire in ways she could never have anticipated. The vulnerable elderly man she had been trying to manipulate was actually a sophisticated property owner who had the power to make decisions that would fundamentally change her living situation and financial security. The apartment she had been living in, decorating, and considering her home was actually owned by the man she had spent months trying to displace and control. The irony was about to become justice, and Jessica was about to learn that underestimating someone's capabilities and resources could have consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings or damaged relationships. Robert had been patient and generous with her interference, but his patience had limits, and those limits had been reached. The time had come for Jessica to face the reality that her actions had consequences, and that those consequences were entirely within Robert's power to determine. The eviction notice arrived at Jessica's apartment on a Tuesday morning in early April, delivered by certified mail with the official seal of Chen and Associates prominently displayed on the envelope. I can only imagine her confusion as she opened what she probably expected to be routine correspondence, only to find a formal legal document informing her that her tenancy at 245 Maple Court was being terminated due to breach of lease terms and that she had 30 days to vacate the premises. The notice, which Emma Chen had crafted with meticulous attention to legal requirements, cited specific violations that Jessica had unknowingly committed during her months of harassing Robert. The lease agreement she had signed contained standard clauses about maintaining respectful relationships with property management and refraining from activities that might damage the reputation or well-being of the property owner. Jessica's campaign of false accusations, her attempts to involve media and social services in fabricated abuse allegations, and her pattern of harassment toward the landlord constituted clear violations of these terms. What made the eviction particularly devastating was the revelation contained in the final paragraph of the notice. Jessica learned for the first time that her landlord, the person she had been paying rent to for nearly a year, was Robert Harrison himself. The man she had been systematically trying to displace from his own home owned the apartment she had been living in, decorating and treating as her personal sanctuary. Every monthly rent payment she had made had been funding the independence she was trying to destroy. The phone call came within an hour of the mail delivery, and I answered to find Jessica's voice shaking with a combination of rage and panic that I had never heard before. She demanded to speak with Robert immediately, insisting that there had been some terrible mistake in the eviction notice. When Robert took the phone, her tone shifted between pleading and threatening as she tried to understand how the situation had developed and what options she might have to reverse it. Robert's response was measured and final. He explained that he had indeed been her landlord throughout her tenancy, that he had chosen not to reveal this information because he preferred to keep his business relationships separate from family interactions. He confirmed that her recent behavior toward him constituted violations of her lease agreement, and that the eviction proceedings were entirely legal and appropriate. He also mentioned that he had been subsidizing her rent by charging her significantly below market rates, a generosity that she had repaid with months of harassment and attempts to control his life. Jessica's attempts to negotiate or plead for reconsideration were met with polite but inflexible responses. Robert had made his decision based on her pattern of behavior, and that decision was final. He suggested that she use the 30-day notice period to secure alternative housing, and he wished her well in her future endeavors. When she began making threats about legal action or renewed attempts to challenge his competence, Robert simply ended the call and asked me to refer any future communications from Jessica to Emma Chen's office. The impact of this reversal extended far beyond Jessica's immediate housing situation. The eviction notice forced her to confront the reality that her understanding of Robert's financial situation had been completely incorrect. The man she had been treating as a vulnerable elderly person whose expenses needed to be carefully managed was actually a sophisticated property owner whose monthly income from rental properties alone exceeded what many people earned in full-time employment. Her campaign to reduce his living costs by forcing him into institutional care had been based on fundamental ignorance about his actual financial resources. More damaging to Jessica's position was the realization that her months of harassment and manipulation had been documented by the very person who controlled her housing situation. Every false report she had made to social services, every attempt to involve media in fabricated abuse allegations, every threatening phone call and inappropriate visit had been recorded and documented by Robert and Emma Chen. This evidence could be used not only to support the eviction proceedings, but also to defend against any future legal challenges Jessica might attempt. The eviction also exposed the extent to which Jessica had been financially dependent on Robert's generosity without recognizing it. The below-market rent she had been paying had allowed her to maintain a lifestyle that her actual income couldn't support. The trendy downtown apartment she had been showcasing on social media, the decorating projects she had undertaken, the social gatherings she had hosted there, had all been subsidized by the man she had been trying to displace and control. Without this hidden subsidy, her financial situation would become significantly more challenging. As word of the eviction spread through Jessica's social circle, the narrative she had been constructing about Robert's decline and her own role as his concerned caretaker began to collapse. Friends and acquaintances who had listened to her complaints about his stubborn resistance to appropriate care began to understand that she had been living in his property while simultaneously trying to force him out of his own home. The irony was so obvious and the behavior so inappropriate that Jessica's credibility was permanently damaged among people who had previously supported her concerns. The professional consequences of Jessica's campaign also began to manifest as the truth about her motivations became clear. The social worker who had investigated her complaints filed a formal report, noting that the concerns had been fabricated and that the complainant appeared to have financial motivations for her accusations. The private investigator who had conducted surveillance documented that his services had been requested under false pretenses. The television reporter who had been contacted about elder abuse made note of Jessica's misleading information in case similar allegations were made in the future. Emma Chen also took steps to protect Robert from future harassment by obtaining a restraining order that legally prohibited Jessica from contacting him directly or visiting his property without permission. The restraining order was granted easily based on the documented pattern of harassment and the clear evidence that Jessica's behavior was motivated by personal gain rather than legitimate concern for Robert's well-being. The legal protection gave Robert the security of knowing that Jessica could face criminal charges if she continued her interference campaign. The 30-day eviction period passed with surprisingly little drama, as Jessica apparently recognized that she had no legal options for challenging the termination of her tenancy. She found temporary housing with a friend while searching for a new apartment, but the rental market in downtown Maple Ridge was competitive and expensive. Without Robert's subsidy, she struggled to find comparable housing that she could afford on her actual income, and she was forced to consider less desirable locations and smaller spaces than she had become accustomed to. During this period, Robert seemed to regain energy and enthusiasm that had been drained by months of defending himself against Jessica's accusations. He began making plans for home improvements and property enhancements that he had been postponing due to the stress of the harassment campaign. He also started discussing charitable activities and community involvement that would honor his late wife's memory and provide meaningful outlets for his time and resources. One of Robert's first decisions was to renovate the apartment that Jessica had vacated, updating it with modern amenities and fixtures that would allow him to charge full market rent to future tenants. He also decided to implement stricter screening procedures for new renters, including background checks and references that would help identify applicants who might pose problems for property management. The experience with Jessica had taught him that generosity in rental arrangements needed to be balanced with appropriate protections for property owners. Robert also used the resolution of the Jessica situation as an opportunity to review and update his estate planning documents. He worked with Emma Chen to ensure that his will and other legal documents clearly specified his wishes about his care and his property, in ways that would prevent future challenges from family members who might disagree with his decisions. He also established legal structures that would protect his charitable intentions and ensure that his resources would be used according to his values rather than the preferences of potential heirs. The changes in Robert's daily life were dramatic and positive. Without the constant stress of defending his choices against unfounded accusations, he was able to return to the activities and relationships that brought him joy. He resumed his regular social activities, including weekly dinners with old friends and monthly meetings of a business networking group he had belonged to for decades. He also began taking on volunteer responsibilities with local charities, using his business experience to help nonprofit organizations improve their operations and expand their impact. My role in Robert's life evolved as well, as the defensive, documentation-heavy approach that Jessica's harassment had required was no longer necessary. I was able to return to the relationship-based, individualized care that had been working so well before Jessica's interference began. Robert and I developed new routines and activities that supported his health and independence, while also providing the companionship and intellectual stimulation he valued. The trust and mutual respect that had been strained by months of scrutiny was fully restored. The broader impact of Jessica's failed campaign extended to her professional and social relationships in ways that she had clearly not anticipated. Her attempts to involve media, social services, and legal authorities in fabricated abuse allegations had created a paper trail that damaged her credibility and reputation. People who had known her as Michael's wife and a member of the Harrison family began to see her as someone who had attempted to exploit and manipulate a grieving elderly man for personal gain. The financial implications of losing her subsidized housing also forced Jessica to make significant changes to her lifestyle and spending habits. Without the below-market rent that Robert had been providing, she had to reduce her discretionary spending and find ways to generate additional income. The financial pressures revealed how much she had been depending on Robert's generosity, without acknowledging or appreciating it. As spring turned to summer, the contrast between Robert's situation and Jessica's became increasingly stark. Robert was thriving in his own home with excellent care and support, engaging in meaningful activities, and using his resources to make positive contributions to his community. Jessica was struggling with housing insecurity, damaged relationships, and the financial consequences of losing the subsidized living arrangement she had taken for granted, while simultaneously trying to destroy the source of that subsidy. The justice of this reversal was not lost on either of us, but Robert took no pleasure in Jessica's difficulties. He had acted to protect his own independence and well-being, not to punish her for her misguided attempts to control his life. When people asked him about the situation, he would simply explain that he had needed to establish appropriate boundaries, and that Jessica's housing situation was now her responsibility to resolve. The experience also strengthened Robert's relationship with the extended family members and friends, who had supported his right to make his own decisions about his care and living situation. People who had been confused or concerned by Jessica's allegations were relieved to learn that Robert was competent and well cared for, and many expressed admiration for the way he had handled the situation with dignity and appropriate firmness. As we settled into new routines that summer, Robert began talking about the future with optimism and excitement that had been absent during the months of harassment. He made plans for traveling to visit old friends, for hosting gatherings in his home, and for taking on new volunteer responsibilities that would use his business skills for charitable purposes. The sense of besiegement that Jessica's campaign had created was replaced by a feeling of possibility and purpose. The resolution of the Jessica situation also provided important lessons about the nature of family relationships and the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries with people who claim to be acting out of concern but are actually motivated by self-interest. Robert's experience demonstrated that genuine care and respect for elderly family members involves supporting their choices and autonomy, not attempting to override their preferences based on assumptions about their capabilities or needs. The story of Jessica's failed manipulation campaign became a cautionary tale within our local community about the importance of understanding someone's actual situation before making judgments about their competence or needs. Several people mentioned to Robert that Jessica's behavior had made them more aware of the potential for family members to exploit or manipulate elderly relatives under the guise of concerned care. For me personally, the experience provided valuable insights into the complex dynamics that can affect caregiving relationships when family members have conflicting agendas or unrealistic expectations. I learned the importance of documenting professional assessments and maintaining clear boundaries with people who might try to interfere with appropriate care arrangements. The situation also reinforced my appreciation for clients like Robert who approach caregiving relationships with respect and partnership rather than control or manipulation. As autumn approached, marking a full year since I had first arrived at Hillcrest Manor, Robert and I reflected on the journey we had taken together and the challenges we had overcome. The harassment campaign that had once seemed so threatening and disruptive had ultimately strengthened our working relationship and demonstrated the importance of standing firm in defense of appropriate boundaries and mutual respect. The final chapter of the Jessica story came in the form of a brief note she sent to Robert in late September, nearly 6 months after the eviction. The note was simple and somewhat grudging, acknowledging that her behavior had been inappropriate and expressing hope that they might be able to maintain some kind of family relationship in the future. Robert's response was gracious but clear about the conditions that would be required for any future contact between them. He replied that he would be willing to maintain cordial family relationships based on mutual respect and appropriate boundaries, but that any future interference in his personal affairs or care arrangements would result in permanent severing of contact. He also made it clear that his living situation and care needs were his own decisions to make, and that he expected those decisions to be respected by all family members regardless of their personal opinions or preferences. The exchange of notes seemed to provide closure for both Robert and Jessica, allowing them to move forward with their separate lives without the ongoing conflict that had dominated their relationship for so many months. Robert was able to focus on his own goals and activities without the distraction of defending his choices against unfounded accusations. Jessica was able to rebuild her life and relationships without the stress of maintaining a campaign that had been both unsuccessful and personally damaging. Today, more than a year after the eviction notice was delivered, Robert continues to thrive in his own home with the support and care that meet his needs and respect his preferences. He has found meaningful ways to use his time and resources that honor his values and contribute to his community. His health remains stable, his cognitive function is sharp, and his social connections are strong and supportive. The experience taught both of us important lessons about the nature of respect, autonomy, and appropriate care relationships. Robert learned that setting firm boundaries with manipulative family members was necessary to protect his own well-being and independence. I learned that professional caregiving sometimes requires defending clients against people who claim to have their best interests at heart, but are actually motivated by self-interest or control. The story of Jessica's failed manipulation campaign serves as a reminder that assumptions about elderly people's capabilities and resources can be dangerous and damaging. Robert's ability to protect himself from harassment and manipulation was directly related to his financial resources and legal knowledge, advantages that not all elderly people possess. The experience highlighted the importance of having professional advocates and support systems that can help vulnerable adults maintain their autonomy and dignity. For anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation, whether as a caregiver, family member, or elderly person facing unwanted interference, the key lessons from Robert's experience are clear. Professional competence evaluations can provide important protection against false accusations of decline or inadequate care. Legal documentation of harassment and manipulation can be crucial for obtaining restraining orders and other protective measures. Most importantly, maintaining detailed records of all interactions and incidents can provide the evidence needed to defend against unfounded allegations and protect appropriate care arrangements. The resolution of this challenging situation ultimately affirmed the importance of treating elderly people with the respect and dignity they deserve, supporting their choices and autonomy, and recognizing that age does not automatically diminish someone's right to make decisions about their own life. Robert's story demonstrates that with appropriate support, clear boundaries, and professional advocacy, it is possible to maintain independence and dignity, even in the face of systematic attempts at manipulation and control. 3 years have passed since that snowy December morning when I first discovered the property documents hidden behind Robert's leather-bound classics. The woman who trembled while reading those lease agreements, who couldn't quite believe that Jessica had been unknowingly paying rent to the very man she was trying to displace, feels like a different person now. Not because I've changed fundamentally, but because I've learned what it means to witness someone reclaim their power with quiet dignity rather than explosive drama. Robert Harrison turned 75 this past spring, and the celebration he hosted at Hillcrest Manor was a testament to how profoundly his life had transformed since Jessica's manipulation campaign finally ended. The garden party drew nearly 60 guests, including old business associates, longtime friends, new acquaintances from his volunteer work, and several families who had benefited from the scholarship fund he established in his late wife's memory. Watching him move through the crowd that afternoon, engaging in animated conversations and laughing with genuine pleasure, I was struck by how different this gathering was from the tense, scrutinized existence he had been living during those difficult months. The scholarship fund had become Robert's primary passion project, a carefully structured charitable initiative that provided educational support for young people from low-income families who showed promise in architecture and design. He had named it the Margaret and Michael Harrison Foundation, honoring both his deceased wife and his son, and he spent considerable time reviewing applications and meeting with recipients. The foundation had already helped 12 students attend college, and Robert took enormous pride in following their academic progress and early career achievements. The success of the foundation had also led to Robert's involvement with several other charitable organizations in the area. He served on the board of directors for a nonprofit housing development group, using his real estate expertise to help create affordable housing options for seniors and young families. He also volunteered with a business mentorship program that paired experienced entrepreneurs with people starting new ventures. These activities provided him with the intellectual stimulation and sense of purpose that had been missing during the months when he was constantly defending his competence and independence. His health had remained remarkably stable, with only minor adjustments to medications and no significant changes in his functional abilities. Dr. Williams continued to express amazement at how well he was aging, attributing his good health to the combination of excellent medical care, appropriate physical activity, strong social connections, and the psychological well-being that came from living according to his own preferences. The stress-related symptoms that had appeared during Jessica's harassment campaign had completely resolved once the external pressure was removed. My role in Robert's life had evolved significantly over these 3 years, shifting from defensive caregiving focused on documentation and protection to collaborative support that emphasized his goals and interests. We had developed routines that balanced his need for assistance with his desire for independence, and our working relationship had deepened into something that felt more like a partnership than a traditional caregiver arrangement. Robert often said that having someone who treated him as a capable adult rather than a problem to be managed had made all the difference in his ability to thrive at home. The property management side of Robert's business had also flourished under his renewed attention and energy. He had hired a professional property management company to handle day-to-day operations while maintaining oversight of major decisions and tenant relations. The renovations he had made to Jessica's former apartment had increased its rental value significantly, and he now charged full market rates while maintaining high standards for property maintenance and tenant screening. His rental income had increased substantially, providing even more resources for his charitable activities. Jessica's life had taken a very different trajectory following her eviction and the collapse of her manipulation campaign. The financial pressures of finding market-rate housing had forced her to take on additional work, and she had eventually moved to a smaller city about an hour away where housing costs were more manageable. Her attempts to rebuild her social and professional reputation had been partially successful, but the story of her behavior toward Robert had followed her in ways that continued to affect her relationships and opportunities. The last direct contact between Robert and Jessica had occurred about 18 months earlier, when she had requested a meeting to discuss what she called unfinished family business. Robert had agreed to meet with her in Emma Chen's office, with the understanding that the conversation would focus on establishing permanent boundaries for any future interactions. The meeting had been brief and formal, resulting in a written agreement that Jessica would not contact Robert directly or visit his property without explicit permission, while Robert agreed to provide references for her rental applications that focused solely on her payment history as a tenant. The agreement had held, with no violations or attempts at renewed contact. Robert occasionally heard news about Jessica through mutual acquaintances, and the reports suggested that she was slowly rebuilding her life, but had learned to be more realistic about her limitations and more respectful of other people's autonomy. Whether this represented genuine personal growth or simply recognition that her previous tactics had backfired was unclear, but the result was the same. Robert was free to live his life without interference or manipulation. The broader impact of Robert's experience had extended beyond his personal situation to influence how other elderly people in the community approached family dynamics and care decisions. Several people had contacted Emma Chen for advice about protecting themselves from manipulative family members, and Robert had occasionally agreed to speak with elderly adults who were facing similar pressures to give up their independence prematurely. His story had become a powerful example of how someone could successfully defend their autonomy when they had the resources and knowledge to do so. Emma Chen had also used Robert's case as the foundation for a workshop series she developed about elder rights and protection from financial exploitation. The workshops, offered through the local senior center and community college, covered topics like recognizing manipulation tactics, understanding legal protections, and building support networks that could help elderly people maintain their independence. The program had been so successful that Emma was considering expanding it to other communities in the region. For me, the experience had profoundly shaped my understanding of what it meant to provide truly person-centered care. The months of defending Robert against false accusations and supporting him through psychological manipulation had taught me the importance of advocacy as a core component of professional caregiving. I had learned that sometimes protecting a client's well-being required standing up to family members who claimed to have their best interests at heart but were actually motivated by self-interest or control. The skills I had developed during that challenging period had made me a more confident and effective caregiver in subsequent situations. I had learned to recognize manipulation tactics earlier, to document concerns more thoroughly, and to advocate more assertively for clients' rights and preferences. These abilities had proven valuable in other caregiving relationships, where family dynamics sometimes created tensions between what clients wanted and what family members thought they should want. The transformation of my living situation had been equally significant. What had begun as temporary housing in the converted carriage house had become a permanent and deeply satisfying home. Robert had offered to sell me the carriage house apartment at a below-market price, recognizing that my care and advocacy had saved him from a situation that could have resulted in the loss of his independence and dignity. The opportunity to build equity while living in such a beautiful setting felt like a gift that I was still learning to fully appreciate. The gardens around the carriage house had become my personal project, a collaboration with Robert that combined his knowledge of the property's history with my interest in medicinal and culinary herbs. We had created raised beds for vegetables, expanded the herb garden, and established a small greenhouse where we experimented with extending the growing season for fresh produce. The gardening work provided both physical activity and therapeutic benefits for Robert, while giving me a creative outlet that complemented my professional responsibilities. The relationship that had developed between Robert and me over these 3 years had transcended the traditional boundaries between caregiver and client, without compromising the professional standards that were essential for effective care. We had become genuine friends who respected each other's expertise and autonomy while working together toward shared goals of health, independence, and meaningful daily life. This evolution had been possible because of the mutual trust and respect that had been established during the crisis period when we had supported each other against external pressures. Robert's legal and financial planning had been updated to reflect the lessons learned from his experience with Jessica's manipulation campaign. His will now included specific provisions designed to prevent future challenges to his competence or his care preferences, and he had established legal structures that would protect his charitable intentions, even if other family members disagreed with his priorities. He had also created detailed advance directives that specified his preferences for care in various scenarios, removing any ambiguity that might allow others to impose their own interpretation of his needs. The Scholarship Foundation had been structured as an independent entity with its own board of directors, ensuring that it would continue operating according to Robert's vision, even after his death. He had recruited board members who shared his commitment to educational opportunity and social justice, and he had established clear criteria for selecting scholarship recipients that reflected his values and priorities. The foundation had already become self-sustaining through careful investment of its initial funding, guaranteeing that it would be able to support students for generations to come. The impact of Robert's charitable work had extended beyond the direct beneficiaries of his foundation to influence broader community conversations about social responsibility and civic engagement. His example had inspired other wealthy community members to become more active in addressing local problems, and several new charitable initiatives had been established following his lead. The ripple effects of his decision to use his resources for positive community impact had multiplied far beyond what he had originally envisioned. The professional recognition that Robert had received for his charitable work had also provided him with new social connections and intellectual challenges that enriched his daily life. He had been invited to serve on advisory committees for several regional nonprofit organizations, and his business expertise was frequently sought by community leaders working on economic development projects. These activities gave him opportunities to contribute his knowledge and experience while learning about new approaches to social and economic challenges. The physical improvements that Robert had made to Hillcrest Manor over the past 3 years had enhanced both its beauty and its functionality while preserving the historical character that made it special. He had updated the heating and electrical systems for greater efficiency and reliability, restored original architectural features that had been covered or damaged over the years, and added modern conveniences that supported his independence without compromising the home's classic elegance. The renovations had increased the property's value while making it more comfortable and accessible for aging in place. The guest house renovation had been Robert's most ambitious project, converting the small building into a comfortable apartment that could accommodate visiting family members or friends without requiring them to stay in the main house. The project had given him enormous satisfaction, combining his appreciation for good design with his practical understanding of how spaces could be adapted to meet changing needs. The guest house had already hosted several visitors, including some of the scholarship recipients who had come to thank Robert personally for their educational opportunities. Looking toward the future, Robert had expressed confidence that his current living arrangement would continue to meet his needs for years to come. His health remained good, his cognitive function was sharp, and his support systems were strong and reliable. He had backup plans in place for various scenarios that might require adjustments to his care or living situation, but these were preventative measures rather than immediate concerns. His experience with Jessica's manipulation campaign had taught him the importance of planning ahead while maintaining realistic optimism about his ability to continue thriving at home. The lessons learned from Robert's experience had implications that extended far beyond his individual situation to broader questions about aging, autonomy, and family relationships in American society. His story demonstrated that elderly people could successfully defend their independence when they had adequate resources and knowledge, but it also highlighted the vulnerability of those who lacked such advantages. The experience had reinforced the importance of legal protections, professional advocacy, and community support systems that could help elderly people maintain their dignity and autonomy regardless of their individual resources. The transformation that had occurred in Robert's life since the resolution of Jessica's manipulation campaign served as a powerful reminder that it was never too late for someone to reclaim their power and rebuild their life according to their own values and preferences. His journey from defensive victim to confident advocate had been possible because he had refused to accept other people's definitions of his capabilities and needs. The quiet strength he had shown in standing up to systematic manipulation had created space for him to flourish in ways that might not have been possible if he had capitulated to external pressure. As I write this reflection on a warm summer evening sitting in the garden behind the carriage house while Robert reads on his porch nearby, I am struck by the peaceful contentment that characterizes our daily life together. The drama and conflict that once dominated our existence have been replaced by purposeful activities, meaningful relationships, and the simple satisfaction of living according to our own choices. The woman who once trembled while reading property documents has become someone who understands that real power often comes not from dramatic gestures, but from quiet persistence in defense of what matters most. The story of Jessica's failed manipulation campaign and Robert's successful defense of his independence will always serve as a reminder that assumptions about elderly people's capabilities can be both wrong and dangerous. Robert's experience proved that age does not automatically diminish someone's right to make decisions about their own life, and that with appropriate support and advocacy, it is possible to maintain dignity and autonomy even in the face of systematic attempts at control and manipulation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.